Tonight on Primetime Politics, facing down Donald Trump.
Let's be clear. We're all on the same page. We won't back down.
Yes, you'll do damage to us in the short term, but we will fight back and we will build back.
But when it comes to the way we approach Donald Trump, we need to have a common, united voice.
Political leaders send a message to the U.S. president. His tariff threats are uniting the country. Coming up, we'll hear what each party is saying and examine the impact it is having on the election campaign. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. There will be no turning back. Those were the words we heard this afternoon from Prime Minister Mark Carney as he addressed the latest tariff threat coming from the U.S. White House. Donald Trump last night signing an executive order imposing a 25% tariff on vehicles made outside the United States to go into effect in April. Now, what that will look like, we still do not know. And today, the Ontario Premier says he was told by the U.S. Commerce Secretary the tariff would not apply to vehicles made in Canada if they contain more than 50% U.S.-made parts. But Mark Carney said it is clear the United States is no longer a reliable trade partner, and then shared these words with Canadians.
I reject. I don't want to set unreasonable expectations. The road ahead will be long. There is no silver bullet. There is no quick fix. And I know and I understand that many are feeling anxious and worried about the future. Fundamental change is always unsettling. But I have every confidence in our country because I understand what President Trump does not. That we love Canada with every fiber of our being. Because we are stronger when we are together, and Canadians are uniting as never before. Now, we are going to have to live the lessons of recent months. First, that we have to look out for ourselves, and second, that we have to look out for each other.
So that was the Prime Minister from earlier this afternoon. As you can see, we're now joined by Lana Payne, President of Unifor, this country's largest private sector union. Lana, thank you for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
So here you have Mark Carney talking about how difficult the times ahead will be for Canadians. And it has me wondering, have you been in contact at all with any officials from the auto companies themselves? Because I'm wondering what they are saying to you as the head of Unifor.
Yeah, actually last week I had meetings with all of them, given what we were likely facing on April 2nd and now what we had dropped on us yesterday by President Trump, which are unjustified, unwarranted, and potentially illegal tariffs that he has placed on the Canadian auto industry and really on Canadian auto workers. And there's one thing at play here. He's trying to steal our jobs, and we're saying no way.
So what are the auto companies saying to you about that? Because they are under pressure from Trump to move operations south of the border.
Yeah, I mean, what I've been saying to them is that, you know, we are in a situation where we have a job to do as a union, and that job is to protect every single auto job in this country, and we're going to do that. And they have to understand that they don't get to bargain our jobs or the Canadian footprint away with Trump. So I've been clear about that. And I have been clear to political leaders that if we have corporations, whether auto corporations or any corporation in Canada, that thinks that they can avoid tariffs by appeasing Trump and giving up or trying to dismantle production in Canada, we have to respond to that in a very big fashion, including what we say to companies who try to shift production out of Canada. Okay,
well, I'll get to the government side of that in a second, but when you say that to the automakers right now, what's the response from them? Do they acknowledge what you're saying? Are they receptive, or do they just listen and leave it at that?
I mean, the reality is they don't want these tariffs either. It disrupts the kind of supply chain that they've established, their line of business. But the reality is, I can't rely on this. I have to fight back in Canada to make sure that we're protecting this. They're going to be having discussions with Trump, and in the end, I hope that those discussions end well for Canadian workers. But I can't just sit back and do nothing and hope and pray that that happens. We have to make our position clear, not just to the automakers, but obviously to government and politicians. And we're in a federal election right now. And what a better time to get people to understand what's at stake.
Okay, dig into what you want from government, though, because if a company, if an automaker decides to move their operations south of the border to the United States, what really can a government do to stop that from happening?
Oh, they can do a lot, because we buy in Canada 2 million vehicles a year. We only make about 1.5 million. The government can say to all these automakers right now, if you want to sell in Canada, you're going to build in Canada. And if you don't, there are going to be penalties for you to try and have access to the Canadian market. And the reality is Trump has put us in this position, and we have to do everything possible as a nation to protect this industry. We've had an auto industry in Canada for well over 100 years, long before Donald Trump, and we're going to have an auto industry long after Donald Trump. But right now, we have to do the right things to protect it and to protect the workers.
Okay. Now, the Globe and Mail has spoken to an unnamed Ontario official, and that person suggests, based on apparently a phone call between Premier Ford and Howard Lutnick, that the Canadian-made vehicles will be less affected by these tariffs than, say, vehicles made in other countries like China and South Korea. So perhaps a smaller tariff than 25%. Does that make it better at all?
No, because what can happen, first of all, I'll believe that when I see it. I've read the executive order that Trump put out yesterday, and that's not what's included in that. So we have to deal with the facts in front of us right now, and that's what's in the executive order. We're facing a tariff. And the reality is a big or small tariff is going to have an impact on the Canadian industry in all kinds of ways, including what happens with future investment, because you can be guaranteed that these companies are not going to put up with tariffs for the long term. We may have a short-term reprieve in some ways, but we will have a long-term bleed, and we will end up losing this industry if we don't act now to protect it.
Okay, now you were with Mr. Carney yesterday when news of the tariff broke, and when it comes to the workers you represent, to the message that you're sharing with us right here, that Canada needs to hit back hard and make sure that American automakers know the consequences of moving operations down south. I'm wondering about the reception your argument, your proposals are getting from the Liberal leader.
We actually had a really good discussion that had been arranged before these tariffs were dumped on us yesterday, and it was to talk about the trade situation. It was to talk about Canadian jobs and Canadian workers and building a more resilient Canadian economy, because we have a lot that we can do. And obviously, our union has a position in terms of how the government can deal with this. We're going to be forceful in that position. And I know Mr. Carney has lots of other things to consider in this regard. But the reality is that it's clear, and I think he's been very clear about what he has said, that Canada's response will have to be strong, and that Canada will have to do everything that it can to protect Canadian workers. And we're going to hold him to that, as I expect that he expects that we would.
Yeah, well, and today we did hear from Mark Carney in his capacity as Prime Minister, saying that Canadians need to be ready, that the road ahead is not going to be an easy road. So if that's the message from the Prime Minister, what's your message right now to Canadian workers, Lana?
Well, the reality is that, yes, the road will be rough. There's a lot we can do to protect Canadian workers. There's a lot we can do to build the Canadian economy. And we have to get on with doing that and showing, workers and all of Canadians that, there's a confidence here that we can build. And I think you've heard from a number of people, including me, over many, many weeks now, that we have a lot of leverage, we have a lot of resources, and there is a lot that we can do, starting with industrial policy. All of the things that we haven't been doing, we can do now. But I would say in this moment, we are a union. and we know how to fight to protect workers, and we're going to do that. I have been very clear to the automakers. I've been very clear to many corporations right now. We're going to do everything as a union to protect these jobs. And I mean everything. And I think when I say that as a union leader, that collectively as an organization that represents working people, we know how to fight, and we're going to fight.
Lana, Payne, always appreciate the time. Thank you for this.
Thank you.
Now, it wasn't just Mark Carney responding to Donald Trump today. We also heard from both the Conservative and NDP leaders. Take a listen to what we heard.
My message to President Trump is knock it off. Stop attacking America's friends. Start trading so that we can once again become richer, stronger, and more secure on both sides of the border.
No matter what the makeup of Parliament is, we need to send a clear message, all political leaders, that together, all of us denounce the illegal attacks on our country. All of us together want Canada to win. We want this trade war to end.
Now, of course, the tariff threat from Donald Trump comes in the middle of a campaign. So let's bring in our political strategist now, Susan Smith, former Liberal strategist, co-founder and principal of Blue Sky Strategy Group, Cole Hogan, a conservative digital strategist, principal at GT, and George Soule, former director of communications for the NDP. Hello to all three of you.
Hello.
Hello. Listen, I'm going to start with you, Cole, today, because, you know, because Donald Trump interjects into week one of this campaign, you now have Mark Carney being able to speak as Prime Minister, not just Liberal leader, but as Prime Minister dealing with a very substantive issue. How difficult is that for a party, your party, when essentially the Conservative leader is trying to change the channel away from Carney vis-a-vis Trump?
Yeah, there's no denying that, you know, being able to respond as, you know, Liberal leader right now, but Prime Minister, you do have that like undeniable advantage in that regard, similar to what Doug Ford was able to do during the Ontario election, where, you know, he went down to the States and you're taking action on Trump and tariffs. So that is an advantage. I think what we're seeing Pierre and the Conservatives try to do day after day, you know, the week leading up to the election and the first week of the election so far, it's been a policy every morning, day after day. So I think you know, that's including, you know, some union endorsements, some solid rallies, and, you know, I think Pierre and the Conservatives in Poilievre's address last night struck the right tone of acknowledging the anxieties that auto workers and Canadians are having about these tariffs, and that's a good start to counteract some of the natural advantage that Carney has right now.
Yeah, I wonder, though, you know, how many people are listening to anything but Donald Trump right now, given this existential threat? George, how difficult is it for the NDP right now as they're trying to find space up against Mark Carney? Because we do know, in terms of polling numbers, it's having an effect on NDP support.
Oh, for sure. I mean, we saw that big swing, you know, to the Prime Minister and we've kind of all gathered around the flag, and, you know, it's just kind of nice in some ways because it means we can take our flag back from where it's, you know, the protesters from a few years ago. But it definitely is a challenge in this election, and it means really connecting with people, and I think we see some of that. Some of those people that have moved are a bit fluid, so hopefully, you know, a whole month is a long time in a campaign. You know, I keep pointing to the fact that, you know, a week before the debates in 2011, before we won 103 seats, we were at 13%, so it can still come, but it's definitely a challenge right now, and you're right, there's not a lot of issues going on. It's all about Trump, and people are worried about what they're going to do with their jobs, how they're going to pay the bills. So, as I've been saying, I think still, if Jagmeet can find a place to say, look, like, it's probably going to be a Liberal government, but you want us in there to keep you honest, and, you know, and if not, then maybe even put us in charge, but really kind of swing that emotional connection. I think that's the path that exists for the NDP to come back, but certainly in the same way it is for the Conservatives. We're watching, right now we're sitting here watching Mark Carney be Prime Minister, and so that's what punches through, that's what's going to be on the evening news, and so it's definitely a challenge in this campaign. Yeah, challenge, although, you know, Susan, to be fair, Mark Carney and the Liberals must be breathing a bit of a sigh of relief, because until Donald Trump spoke yesterday, the focus yesterday was actually questions about Brookfield, about pension plans that he helped co-manage, registered in Bermuda. How much of a blessing is this for Liberal strategists?
Donald Trump isn't a blessing for anybody, Michael. He's not a blessing for the Canadian economy. He's not a blessing for Canadian jobs. What he has done is rivet the focus of this campaign where it should be, and that's the future of the Canadian economy. That's how do we build resilience in the economy? How do we broaden our trade relationships? Who do we trust as our national security partners? And that's what Mark Carney's been talking about, and that's what he did in his first week as Prime Minister, is address those things. Now he's on the campaign trail. He's paused he's paused the campaign part of things, and he is doing the prime ministerial part of things that you do in a caretaker government, and making sure that this country is ready for whatever Donald Trump is going to throw at us. It's not going to be an overnight solution. It's going to be difficult. Everybody's talked about that. But I think, he was with Canadian auto workers yesterday. I think people are listening, and that's why you see the polling numbers where they are. You talked about Doug Ford and the Ontario polls. The Conservatives are even releasing their internal provincial polls that show that Carney is talking about what Canadians want to be talking about, and the opposition isn't punching through with the things that they want to be talking about.
Okay, so the announcement comes yesterday. The tariffs are meant to come to effect next Wednesday. So at least for this week, if not for the days and the weeks that follow, Donald Trump and the tariffs that come down the pipes is going to dominate the news cycle with or without an election campaign. So how does that change the campaigns, if at all, Cole?
Sure, I think you're going to have to, Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives are going to have to respond and talk a little bit more about Trump and tariffs. There's been some stuff that the substance of which has been we need to be less reliant on the Americans in terms of Canadian energy the last 10 years. The Conservatives say haven't been good on the economic front or in terms of getting energy across our own borders internally. So what they'll say now is all right, now we need to become less reliant on America, and the fact that 75% of our exports go to one place. We need change, and that needs to happen in order for us to not be in a scenario like this in the future.
There's a challenge for Mr. Poilievre because over a quarter of his base, the people who vote Conservative, like Donald Trump and like Trumpism. And Mr. Poilievre's campaign has largely been built on things that are Trumpist, right? Think about cutting the CBC versus what's happening with NPR. Think about Fournier. There are so many parallels. So Mr. Poilievre is afraid to let go of that base, yet at the same time, he's got to try and pretend he's Captain Canada when he's been doing anything but for the last 2 years.
George?
That actually that's a huge problem for sure. I mean, no one's going to compare, or at least nobody reasonable would compare Pierre Poilievre and say he is Donald Trump. But it's absolutely true that a third to a quarter of his base, or a quarter to a third of his base, supports Donald Trump. They just do. And so when they're doing the math, they look and say, well, Mark Carney is moving to the center right and squeezing us over on that side, so we can't give up this far right flank. And so you're watching Pierre Poilievre struggle to keep that language and then not be able to be as strong against the President of the United States, who's right now attacking not only our economy but our sovereignty. So Pierre Poilievre's got to look kind of tough but still play along with his friends. And so that's, I think, where that openness is on the side. While Mark Carney talks about things at a high level, Pierre Poilievre tries to hang on to the far right. Hopefully the NDP can remind folks that we're there with workers. We saw that with Jagmeet today. Over 1 million workers through their unions have supported Jagmeet over just the last week. So hopefully we can find some traction there.
Okay, I do also wonder as to how you campaign for seats and try to knock your opponent while at the same time strike a tone of Team Canada, we're united up against the United States. Is that even possible in the midst of a campaign, Cole?
Sure. I think that there's going to be a few different approaches. I think province by province, we'll see a different approach for each party leader. I think Carney did have a couple bad days in French. There's no denying that. I think he'll still be hounded by the Bloc Québécois in that province for competition for seats. And I think there'll still be questions around Brookfield and the conflicts of interest. So we'll see how that plays out in Quebec, along with, not attending the debate and some other flubs that have happened there. Ontario will be a big battlefield. The West, the Conservatives hold on to, will try to be as competitive as possible in Ontario, and then it'll come down to, potentially a three-way split in BC. And for the NDP, I think it's a little tough right now. Maybe things can shift, and good God, I hope they do.
Okay, well, let's see if God is actually. Okay, Susan, because I know you're dying to get in.
Cole talked about province to province. Let's talk about Danielle Smith going down to speak to a far-right group, fundraising for a far-right group, and telling Breitbart News that Pierre is in sync with Donald Trump. That's not going to help Mr. Poilievre in his campaign going forward. Doug Ford clearly, and the Conservatives of Ontario, clearly do not favor a Poilievre government. Mr. Legault in Quebec is neutral. Scott Moe is blue, as blue he can be. That's not going to change. But Mr. Poilievre has some challenges across the country. Mr. Singh's challenge is to get people to see him as someone who can stand up to Trump. I still respectfully don't believe he's really in that conversation. It's between Carney and Trump. But Mr. Carney is talking about the things that are keeping people up at night, and they are connected to, you know, the big picture issue on tariffs and trade actually connect to people's kitchen tables as well. If they lose their jobs because of tariffs, or there's a mitigation measure, that's what the Liberals and Mr. Carney's been putting forward. Poilievre has to do a significant pivot. There's a new book about him. It's called Ripper, and the book Mr. Carney has put out last year is called Values. That really shows you the narrative that's been there. It's going to be difficult for Mr. Poilievre to pivot.
Okay, George, I don't know if the United Front is even possible based on those answers, but is a Team Canada approach possible in this campaign, or is it going to necessarily be divisive?
Well, I think that is the challenge. I think at some point there's probably room for some kind of like all the parties to come together if we can do that. I don't think that is really in Pierre Poilievre's style or in his experience, but maybe he'll get desperate enough and give it a whirl. And I think that would be good. I think, how do you run a campaign these days? I think, I keep going back to the campaign that I worked on, but it's because you see Oshawa on TV these days, right? And so you have to talk to people, again, not even at 30,000 feet, like right on the line where, literally that's where Jagmeet is today, where folks are getting off shift in Windsor. These people, for the second time in a month and a bit, they're being threatened with maybe losing their jobs in days. And that's over 100,000 people we're talking about across this country. And that's just that's the first run through. So these people are scared. We need to figure out ways to make sure we can actually support them. We need to set up immediately, like make sure EI is there to have their back, make sure that we actually have some plans in the short term, not just the longer term. Yes, we can have, build cars here in Canada forever.
But they're there. The EI measures have been put in place. The job sharing measures have been put in place.
Well, it's more than we need more than just the half that the EI does. We're going to have to really make sure we have people's backs, because otherwise we're going to be defaulting on mortgages, and it's going to be really, really, really hard times for a lot of people across this country.
Yeah, well, I don't think there's any illusion as how difficult this will be when the tariffs actually do come down in whatever form. But listen, I appreciate the conversation this evening. Cole, Susan, George, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, well, let's turn to the numbers now and bring in polls analyst Philippe Fournier to the conversation, the founder and the writer of 338 Canada. Philippe, thank you for joining us again.
Good evening, Michael.
So, Donald Trump, and I want to begin there because he was already having this impact on the federal election campaign, essentially shifting the ballot box question for many Canadians. But now comes this tariff threat, 25% on vehicles made outside the United States. How do you think that's going to affect the campaigns?
Well, this is a very good question. I think it's also a very legitimate one, but we do not know the answer to this prior, for the simple reason that it depends on how the leaders and the parties react to it. In January, Michael, when Mr. Trump started his daily attacks on Canada's economy and sovereignty, we saw the numbers in the polls move, but only after we saw the initial reaction of Justin Trudeau and Pierre Poilievre, for instance. Justin Trudeau basically said, we're not going to stand for that. And the first reaction of Mr. Poilievre was, well, this is Justin Trudeau's fault. And so I think voters reacted to that. Now we'll see in the coming days how the reaction of the Canadian electorate is regarding the numbers. But it's going to have an effect for sure, but which way, I'm not sure.
Okay, well, watching for that, although, as we say that, we should also talk about your latest analysis here, because the numbers are a bit gobsmacking. Let's take a look at the top line here, because you currently have the Liberals ahead of the Conservatives at 41%, the Conservatives at 37%, the NDP at 9%, the Bloc at 6%, the Greens at 3%. But,
that's right.
Talk to us about the shifting numbers, because, we're still talking about within margins of error, I think. So what's the durability of these numbers?
Well, I would say that there's a huge difference between having a 4-point gap between the two parties in one single poll or one 4-point gap in the aggregate of polls. So this is the average, the weighted average of polling that sees the Liberals climbing. The Conservatives still in the high 30s, but suddenly the high 30s is not enough when you have an NDP now in single digits, and the Liberals have been the beneficiary of this NDP collapse. And so, yes, the numbers are still close in the vote count, But in the seat count, it is not close anymore. This is no longer a toss-up. Obviously, Michael, very careful. I'm not making a prediction here. I'm telling you the projection of the day, the numbers we see right now. The Liberals are deep in majority territory with the numbers we have today.
Yeah, 187 as we take a look at that board right now. 187 is what you have the Liberals at, the Conservatives at 126, the Bloc down to 23, the NDP down to 6, and the Greens down to 1 seat. And I think, before you went on air, you were saying that that's the Kitchener Centre seat. So
right.
When you look at this kind of seat projection, it is still very early on in the campaign, though, Philippe. Can we take this to the bank, or is this going to? Yeah, exactly. So talk to us about that.
I'm very glad you asked the question, Michael, because I get it from many readers and observers and journalists. Can we take this to the bank? The answer is no. The numbers have moved so much in the past 2 months that it would really be a fool's bet to say they won't change again. Now, however, the Conservatives, we have to say, they went from super majority territory in around 230 seats 2 months ago and are now facing very good odds of losing if an election was held tonight. And the Liberals went from, they were done, they were cooked, they were behind the Bloc Québécois in the seat projections, not in Quebec, but from coast to coast. And now we see them in good position. This is not a fluke as much as is a result of tons of data from the polls, but also regional data that shows that Liberals have recovered and are leading in Atlantic Canada. The Liberals have taken the lead in Quebec, overtaking the Bloc. Right now, we see the Liberals having an advantage in Ontario, and also British Columbia, with the collapse of the NDP, has really been good to the Liberals lately. You combine all this. This is a majority for the Liberals if they can hold it.
Okay, you talked about Quebec, and again, the projection currently has the Bloc down to 23 seats. But, I wonder how closely you'll be watching Quebec, because, Mr. Carney may be enjoying positive reviews right now, but in this first week of the campaign, there have been some major questions about his time at Brookfield. More importantly, for Quebec voters, he flubbed Nathalie Provost's name, his own Liberal candidate and a survivor of the massacre at l'École Polytechnique, which Carney mistakenly called Concordia. What are you watching there?
Well, okay, so these flubs, if they become a pattern, will be a problem for Mr. Carney. That's no doubt about it. However, right now the ballot box question is still who can stand up to the American administration. And in the numbers we see, not only is the ballot box question in Quebec similar to that in Canada, but we see even higher numbers for how to deal with the Americans in Quebec. Obviously, steel, aluminum, and all these resources that we sell to the Americans. So if these flubs are repeated, it could be a problem. But with how fast the media cycles go nowadays, this could be forgotten by next week.
Okay, well, here we are, week one of the campaign, and of course, Donald Trump figuring large once again. Philippe, thank you for this. We'll speak again next week. Thank you for the time this evening.
Always a pleasure, Michael.
And that is Primetime Politics for this Thursday. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. Primetime Politics is back tomorrow evening. Until then, take care.